The entertainment world is in absolute shock tonight after what insiders are calling the most explosive clash of egos in late-night television history. Bono, the legendary U2 frontman and global humanitarian activist, was forcibly removed from The Late Show with Stephen Colbert following a heated confrontation that shattered the facade of intellectual civility and exposed the dark side of performative politics. What should have been a meeting of minds between two supposed champions of social justice turned into a career-defining moment that revealed the difference between authentic passion and calculated smugness. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, because this story contains exclusive behind-the-scenes details that will completely change how you see both of these powerful figures. The shocking truth about what happens when genuine activism meets performative intellectualism goes deeper than anyone imagined, and we've got insider information that reveals the toxic collision between real conviction and manufactured moral authority. According to sources close to the production, Bono had been looking forward to this appearance for months. The U2 frontman, known for his decades of activism on poverty, AIDS, and global inequality, had specifically requested Stephen's show because of its reputation for substantive political discussion. Bono believed he would find a kindred spirit in Stephen, someone who shared his passion for social justice and his willingness to use their platform for meaningful change. Bono was genuinely excited about going on Colbert, revealed a member of the rock star's management team who witnessed the devastating aftermath. He'd been following Stephen's political commentary and thought they were aligned on most issues. Bono saw this as an opportunity to have a real conversation about activism, about using fame responsibly, about making actual change in the world. He had no idea he was walking into an intellectual ambush. The red flags started appearing during the pre-interview coordination process. While Bono's team had provided talking points about U2's latest project and his ongoing humanitarian work, Stephen's producers seemed unusually focused on creating confrontational moments rather than collaborative discussion. They kept asking for Bono's most controversial opinions, explained a publicist familiar with the booking process. They wanted his takes on specific politicians, his criticism of American foreign policy, his views on capitalism. We thought they wanted substantive debate, but looking back, it feels like they were loading ammunition. Behind the scenes, crew members described an atmosphere that felt more like preparation for a debate tournament than a celebrity interview. Stephen was reportedly spending unusual amounts of time researching obscure details about Bono's activism, studying his past statements for inconsistencies, and preparing what staff described as gotcha questions, designed to expose supposed contradictions in the rock star's worldview. Stephen had this massive research file about every political statement Bono had ever made, recalled a production assistant who witnessed the sinister preparations. He wasn't studying it to understand Bono's perspective or build on their shared values. He was looking for ways to make Bono look hypocritical or naive. It felt like watching someone prepare for intellectual warfare rather than meaningful conversation. What made the situation even more volatile was Stephen's well-documented need to be the smartest person in every room. Industry insiders reveal that the late-night host has a pattern of intellectually bullying guests who threaten his image as the ultimate political commentator, particularly those whose activism predates his own career or whose convictions run deeper than his television persona. Stephen has always been threatened by people with authentic conviction, explained a former show writer who left after becoming uncomfortable with the host's increasingly aggressive tactics. Bono has been fighting for social justice since before Stephen even had a career. His activism isn't performed for cameras, it's his life's work. That kind of authentic passion makes Stephen's intellectual posturing look shallow by comparison. The tension escalated when Bono arrived at the studio, bringing his characteristic intensity and genuine enthusiasm for discussing the issues he cares about most. Witnesses describe the rock star as being energized by the prospect of reaching Stephen's politically engaged audience with messages about global poverty and social responsibility. His authentic passion for helping the world's most vulnerable people made what Stephen was planning seem even more calculated and cruel. But Stephen's behavior during their pre-show meeting immediately set off alarm bells among staff who understood both men's personalities. Bono was being his usual passionate self, talking about his latest work in Africa and his hope for changing government policy, observed a stage manager who's facilitated hundreds of celebrity interviews. But Stephen was responding with this weird condescending tone, like he was humoring a naive idealist. It was clear he saw Bono as someone to be intellectually dominated rather than engaged with as an equal. Behind closed doors, makeup artists and wardrobe staff noticed that Stephen kept making subtle digs about celebrity activism, questioning whether rock stars could truly understand complex political issues. He kept making comments about rock star saviors and asking if Bono ever felt guilty about preaching from his privileged position, revealed a makeup artist who worked with both men. Bono was trying to engage seriously, but you could see him getting frustrated with Stephen's cynical attitude toward genuine humanitarian work. The backstage atmosphere grew increasingly tense as showtime approached. Bono, with his natural passion for social justice, began showing signs of agitation as he picked up on Stephen's dismissive energy toward causes that define his life's work. Meanwhile, Stephen was reportedly making final preparations for what crew members later described as a systematic intellectual assassination designed to expose what he saw as the hypocrisy of celebrity activism. "You could feel the collision building," described an audience coordinator who helped seat guests before the taping. The crew was uncomfortable because they could see Stephen was planning to attack someone whose humanitarian work is genuinely respected worldwide. Bono has actually moved mountains for people in need, and Stephen was preparing to tear him down for intellectual sport. It felt like watching someone prepare to destroy something sacred. As the cameras prepared to roll and Bono took his position, with characteristic intensity, production assistants were already expressing concern about what they feared was about to happen. The collision between Bono's authentic activism and Stephen's performative intellectualism was about to create a television moment that would expose the difference between genuine conviction and manufactured moral authority. Nobody could have predicted just how viciously Stephen would attack someone whose life's work was helping the world's most vulnerable people. What unfolded next will be remembered as one of the most shocking displays of intellectual arrogance over authentic compassion in television history. As the cameras rolled and Stephen delivered his opening monologue, viewers immediately sensed something predatory in his demeanor, the calculated smugness of someone preparing to intellectually destroy a person whose convictions threatened his carefully constructed image as the ultimate political authority. When he introduced Bono, his tone carried an undercurrent of condescension that made everyone who understands genuine activism sick to their stomachs. "Please welcome a man who's spent decades trying to save the world from his private jet. The one and only Bono." The introduction was loaded with cynical undertones that immediately signaled this wasn't going to be a celebration of one of the world's most dedicated humanitarian activists. When Bono walked onto the stage with his characteristic passion and genuine commitment to changing the world, the contrast between his authentic conviction and Stephen's manufactured moral superiority was disturbing to witness. The interview began with seemingly standard questions about U2's latest work, but viewers who understand intellectual bullying could see Stephen laying elaborate traps with surgical precision. Bono, with his natural tendency to turn every conversation toward helping those in need, responded with the kind of passionate honesty that has driven decades of humanitarian work. He spoke about his latest efforts in Africa, his frustration with government inaction on global poverty, and his belief that those with platforms have obligations to use them for good. "You know, Bono, you've been doing this activism thing for quite a while now," Stephen said with a smile that looked more like a sneer. "Decades of flying around the world, meeting with world leaders, telling governments how to solve problems. It's really quite remarkable how you've managed to position yourself as the conscience of the Western world. The way Stephen emphasized position yourself and managed was like a verbal assault, suggesting that Bono's decades of tireless humanitarian work was somehow calculated self-promotion rather than genuine conviction. But Bono, with his natural passion and assumption that others shared his commitment to justice, responded with characteristic intensity. "Stephen, I don't position myself as anything," Bono replied with growing energy. "I use whatever influence I have because children are dying of preventable diseases, because extreme poverty is solvable, because those of us with platforms have a responsibility to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. This isn't about me. It's about them." The response was pure Bono, selfless, passionate, and focused entirely on helping the world's most vulnerable people. Any decent person would have been moved by such authentic commitment to human dignity. But Stephen Colbert isn't interested in human dignity, and what he did next will define him as someone who attacks compassion for intellectual sport. Responsibility. That's an interesting word, Stephen said with mock thoughtfulness that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably. Though I have to ask, and I hope you don't mind me being intellectually honest here, but who exactly appointed you as the spokesperson for global poverty? I mean, you're a rock star from Dublin who's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. What qualifies you to lecture world leaders about economics and foreign policy? The attack on Bono's credentials and moral authority was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Stephen had just dismissed decades of studied activism, countless hours working with economists and policy experts, and measurable improvements in global health outcomes as somehow illegitimate because they came from a musician rather than a politician. Bono's face went through a series of emotions: confusion at the hostility, frustration at having his life's work dismissed, and then something that made everyone in the room lean forward. The Irish fire that emerges when someone attacks his commitment to helping the suffering. "What qualifies me?" Bono's voice began to rise with the passion that has moved mountains for the world's poor. "What qualifies me is that I've spent the last 30 years studying these issues, working with the best minds in development economics, and actually seeing results. The Global Fund has saved 50 million lives, Stephen. PEPFAR has transformed the AIDS crisis in Africa. These aren't abstract political debates. These are human lives." But Stephen wasn't interested in human lives or measurable results. He was interested in intellectual domination, and he wasn't finished with his systematic destruction of authentic activism. "Oh, I'm sure you've studied, Bono. I'm sure you've read the briefing papers your handlers provide. But don't you think there's something almost colonial about a wealthy Irish rock star flying into Africa and telling Africans what they need? Isn't that just white saviorism with a rock and roll soundtrack?" The studio fell into uncomfortable silence. Stephen had just weaponized progressive terminology to attack someone whose work had literally saved millions of lives, turning social justice language into a cudgel against actual social justice work. Several audience members looked genuinely disturbed by the intellectual dishonesty they were witnessing. Those sitting close to the stage could see Bono's hands clenching as he processed the bad faith attack on work that had consumed his life and transformed continents. "Colonial?" he said, his Irish accent thickening with emotion. "Stephen, I work with African leaders, African organizations, African solutions. I amplify African voices that aren't being heard in Western capitals. The people I work with invited me into this fight because they needed allies with access to power." The response was brilliant, factual, passionate, and completely devastating to Stephen's cynical narrative. But instead of acknowledging the truth, Stephen doubled down with the kind of intellectual dishonesty that defines pseudo-intellectuals everywhere. "Access to power, right?" Stephen said with a smirk that revealed his true character. "And I'm sure it has nothing to do with the tax advantages of charitable work or the way activism burnishes your image when album sales aren't what they used to be. Come on, Bono. We're both smart people here. Can't we acknowledge that celebrity activism is at least partly about celebrity brand management? The suggestion that Bono's humanitarian work was motivated by tax benefits and publicity was so fundamentally evil that several audience members actually booed. Stephen had just accused someone who had donated hundreds of millions of his own money and decades of his life to fighting poverty of doing it for selfish reasons. Bono sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his famous intensity building as he realized he wasn't dealing with someone interested in good-faith discussion about saving lives, but with someone who wanted to destroy the very concept of using privilege for good. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the controlled fury of someone whose life's work had been attacked by someone who had never sacrificed anything for anyone. "You know what, Stephen?" he said, his voice quiet but loaded with Irish fire. "I came here thinking I was talking to someone who understood that we have obligations to each other. Someone who got that those of us with platforms should use them for more than just clever jokes about other people's genuine efforts to help." Theme. The rebuke hung in the air like a judgment, and for a moment it seemed like Stephen might realize he had attacked something sacred. But instead of showing any trace of decency, he made the mistake that would ignite Bono's legendary temper. What happened next will be remembered as one of the most spectacular displays of righteous Irish fury in television history. Stephen's suggestion that Bono's humanitarian work was motivated by tax benefits and brand management was the match that lit the fuse of decades of frustration with cynical intellectuals who mock genuine efforts to save lives. When Bono finally exploded, it was with the full force of his legendary passion unleashed without any media training filter. Obligations? "Oh, that's rich," Stephen said with a condescending laugh that revealed the full extent of his moral bankruptcy. "You talk about obligations like you're some kind of moral authority. But let's be honest here. Your biggest obligation is to your shareholders at Live Nation and your tax advisors in the Netherlands. The Saint Act is just good business, isn't it?" The attack on Bono's financial arrangements and the suggestion that his activism was an act was so fundamentally insulting that the studio audience began expressing their disgust audibly. But Stephen, intoxicated by his own intellectual cruelty, pushed even further into territory that would awaken the full force of Bono's Irish temperament. "I mean, we've all seen the headlines about U2's tax arrangements," Stephen continued with sadistic satisfaction. "Preaching about global poverty while moving your publishing to the Netherlands to avoid Irish taxes. Telling governments to spend more on aid while you're busy avoiding the taxes that fund that aid. Isn't that just a little hypocritical?" That was the moment everything changed. Bono's face transformed from frustrated confusion to something much more dangerous. The righteous fury of someone whose life's work had been attacked by someone who had never lifted a finger to help another human being. Slowly, with the controlled intensity that has made him a legend, he stood up from his chair. "Hypocritical?" Bono's voice started low but began building with the power that has filled stadiums worldwide. "You want to talk about hypocrisy, Stephen?" The Irish accent was getting thicker now, a sure sign that the man behind the rock star persona was emerging with volcanic force. "I've spent 30 years of my life fighting for people who have nothing, while you've spent your career making jokes from behind a desk," Bono continued, his voice rising with each word. "I've sat in meetings with presidents and prime ministers, fighting for AIDS funding while children were dying. I've walked through refugee camps and held babies who won't live to see their first birthday because of preventable diseases." The studio was transfixed by the raw power pouring from the stage. This wasn't the polished rock star they were used to seeing. This was pure, unfiltered Irish passion from someone whose convictions run deeper than most people's souls. Security personnel moved closer, but they seemed uncertain about intervening in what was clearly a moral reckoning. Stephen, clearly realizing he had unleashed something far beyond his ability to handle, attempted to regain control with nervous laughter. "Bono, hey, calm down there, rock star. We're just having an intellectual conversation here. No need to get so emotional about it. Emotional? Bono's voice reached levels that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Ed Sullivan Theater. You attack my life's work, question my motives for trying to save lives, and then tell me not to get emotional. Do you have any idea what you've just done here, Stephen? By now the show's executive producer had rushed onto the stage, desperately trying to manage a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. But Bono was in full Irish fury mode now, channeling decades of frustration with armchair critics who mock genuine efforts to change the world. You want to know about hypocrisy, Stephen? Bono continued, his legendary intensity now focused like a laser on his target. Hypocrisy is sitting in your comfortable studio making jokes about other people's efforts to help, while you've never put yourself on the line for anything bigger than your next comedy bit. Hypocrisy is using your platform to tear down people who are actually trying to make a difference. The audience was in complete shock, witnessing something that transcended entertainment into pure moral authority. This wasn't a celebrity tantrum. This was a masterclass in authentic passion, defending itself against calculated cynicism, a man whose work had saved millions defending the very concept of using privilege for good. Jimmy, his face now pale and sweating, made another desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Security!" he called out frantically. "We need to... Bono's clearly lost control here. We need to get him off the set before this gets worse." The suggestion that Bono needed to be removed for defending his humanitarian work was the nuclear option that sealed Stephen's fate forever. Bono turned toward the host with such intensity that Stephen actually pushed his chair back from his desk. "Lost control?" Bono's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouting. "I haven't lost control, Stephen. I've found my voice. And my voice is telling you that what you've done here tonight is attack. The very idea that people with platforms should use them to help those who have nothing." The studio had fallen into absolute silence, everyone understanding they were witnessing something sacred. A genuinely passionate person defending not just himself, but the entire concept of authentic activism against intellectual cynicism. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Stephen?" Bono continued, his voice gaining power with every word. "You could use your intelligence, your platform, your influence to actually help people. Instead, you use it to tear down those who are trying. That's not intellectualism. That's moral cowardice disguised as cleverness." By now, security was actively moving toward the stage, but Bono's obvious moral authority made them hesitant to treat him as the aggressor. The head of security approached cautiously, clearly unsure whether to treat this as a mental health crisis or a justified response to intellectual abuse. "Mr. Bono," the security chief said carefully, "we need you to please calm down and—" "Don't you dare!" Bono whirled around, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made the security guard step backward. "Don't you dare try to silence me for defending the work that has saved millions of lives. This man invited me onto his show and then attacked everything I stand for. I have every right to respond." Stephen, clearly terrified by what he had unleashed, made one final attempt to maintain his narrative. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said desperately. "The ego, the self-righteousness, the inability to handle legitimate criticism. This is celebrity activism in a nutshell." But Bono wasn't finished delivering what would become the most quoted defense of authentic activism in television history. "Legitimate criticism?" he repeated, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had actually changed the world. "Stephen, legitimate criticism would engage with the work, the results, the lives saved. What you did was attack my character and motives without acknowledging that millions of people are alive today because of the work you just dismissed as a publicity stunt." As security finally moved in, Bono delivered his final devastating assessment. "The difference between us, Stephen, is that when I leave here tonight, I'll still be fighting for people who need help. You'll still be making jokes about people who actually give a damn. Which one of us do you think history will remember? And with that crushing final blow, Bono walked off the stage with his dignity and moral authority intact, leaving behind a humiliated host and the most powerful defense of authentic activism ever captured on television. The fallout from Bono's explosive exit began before he even reached the studio door. Within minutes, cell phone footage from outraged audience members was exploding across every social media platform on Earth. Despite CBS Security's frantic attempts to contain what they knew was a career-defining disaster, by the time Bono had left the building, still radiating the moral authority that comes from decades of genuine service, Bono was trending globally with over 150 million views in the first 2 hours alone, making it one of the fastest-growing hashtags in social media history. What happened backstage in those crucial moments has been described by witnesses as both inspiring and heartbreaking. Bono wasn't angry anymore once he got away from the cameras, revealed a crew member who comforted the rock star. He was just disappointed. He kept saying, "I thought he understood what we're trying to do," over and over. Even after being attacked so viciously, he was still thinking about how this might affect public support for the causes he fights for. That's the kind of person he is. Meanwhile, Stephen sat alone on his destroyed stage as the studio audience filed out in unprecedented disgust. Unlike previous incidents, people weren't just disappointed. They were genuinely angry at witnessing an attack on humanitarian work that had literally saved millions of lives. Several audience members actually confronted Stephen on their way out, with one shouting, "You attacked someone who saves children's lives for a living." The comment would later become a viral video with over 80 million views. Behind closed doors at CBS, emergency meetings were already declaring the end of Stephen's moral credibility, as executives realized they were facing the most catastrophic celebrity incident in network history. This wasn't just bad publicity, disclosed a network insider who witnessed the executive panic firsthand. This was the complete destruction of Stephen's image as a thoughtful political commentator. He had just attacked one of the world's most respected humanitarians for trying to save lives. His credibility was obliterated instantly. But the real earthquake came when Bono's representatives released a statement that united the global humanitarian community against Stephen Colbert. Unlike typical Hollywood damage control, this response carried the moral weight of decades of life-saving work. Mr. Bono came tonight to discuss urgent humanitarian needs affecting millions of vulnerable people worldwide, the statement read. Instead, he was subjected to a calculated attack on the very concept of using privilege to help those who have nothing. What happened tonight represents an assault on the idea that those with platforms have moral obligations to serve something greater than themselves. The revelation that Stephen had deliberately targeted one of the world's most effective humanitarian activists completely united every corner of the global aid community against him. Within hours, major humanitarian organizations, world leaders, and ordinary people who had been helped by Bono's work began expressing their outrage at what they had witnessed. Defend humanitarian work became a rallying cry that transcended entertainment into a global defense of compassionate activism. The response from the humanitarian world was unprecedented in its speed and unanimity. Leaders from every major aid organization began publicly supporting Bono while condemning Stephen's attack on the entire concept of celebrity activism. What Stephen did was an attack on hope itself, said the head of one major AIDS organization, whose comment received 12 million likes within hours. Bono's work has saved more lives than most governments. Mocking that work for intellectual sport is beyond contempt. Perhaps the most damaging response came from the people whose lives had been directly impacted by Bono's activism. AIDS patients in Africa began sharing videos thanking Bono for the medications that kept them alive. Medications funded by programs he had fought to create. Parents of children saved by malaria prevention initiatives spoke out about what his work meant to their families. World leaders who had worked with him on debt relief and aid programs publicly defended his character and effectiveness. The entertainment industry's response revealed a shocking divide between those who understood genuine activism and those who saw it as performance. Major musicians, particularly those involved in humanitarian work, began publicly supporting Bono while distancing themselves from Stephen's cynical worldview. "What Stephen did was disgusting," tweeted one Grammy-winning artist whose comment went viral. "Bono has literally saved millions of lives, and Stephen attacked him for it. That tells you everything you need to know about both men." The ratings collapse was immediate and historically devastating. Stephen's show lost 85% of its audience in the week following the incident, with major humanitarian sponsors pulling their advertising so rapidly that entire episodes had to be filled with generic network promotions. Industry analysts began openly questioning whether The Late Show could survive what many were calling the most morally bankrupt interview in television history. Meanwhile, Bono experienced something remarkable in his decades-long career: global recognition not just as a musician, but as a moral leader who had been unjustly attacked for his compassion. His social media following exploded as people discovered the true scope of his humanitarian impact. Major news outlets began running detailed features about his actual achievements: the 50 million lives saved by the Global Fund, the debt relief that freed entire nations, the AIDS programs that transformed a continent. "Bono showed us what real moral courage looks like," posted one fan whose comment received 8 million likes. "He didn't just defend himself. He defended the idea that we have obligations to help each other. Stephen tried to destroy that idea, and it backfired spectacularly." The sentiment was echoed millions of times as people shared stories of how Bono's activism had directly impacted their lives or communities. The incident sparked what humanitarian experts are calling the Colbert effect, a global conversation about the responsibility of public figures to support causes beyond themselves. Universities began teaching courses on Bono's response as an example of defending authentic activism against cynical attacks. Political science programs analyzed Stephen's tactics as a case study in how intellectual arrogance can destroy moral credibility. 1 year later, the consequences have reshaped both entertainment and humanitarian culture. Stephen's show remains on the air, but he has become a pariah in activist circles and has lost all credibility as a political commentator. His attack on genuine humanitarian work is cited as the moment when performative intellectualism revealed its moral bankruptcy. No major humanitarian organization will work with him, and his political commentary is now viewed through the lens of his attack on authentic compassion. Bono, meanwhile, has been elevated to unprecedented status as someone who successfully defended the entire concept of compassionate activism against cynical attack. He's received honors from major humanitarian organizations, universities have created scholarships in his name, and his activism has gained renewed support from people who were inspired by his passionate defense of helping others. World leaders now cite his confrontation with Stephen as an example of how to respond to bad faith attacks on good work. Sometimes you have to defend not just yourself, but the idea that we can use whatever gifts we have to help those who need. "At most," he said in his only extended comment about the incident during a recent humanitarian summit, "when cynicism attacks compassion, compassion has to fight back, not with cynicism, but with truth." The quote has become a rallying cry for humanitarian workers worldwide and is taught in courses on moral leadership. The Bono versus Stephen Colbert showdown will be remembered as the moment when authentic activism triumphed over performative intellectualism, when compassion defeated cynicism, and when the world united to defend the idea that privilege comes with moral obligations. It proved that attacking someone who dedicates their life to helping others will always backfire, and that genuine moral authority will always triumph over manufactured intellectual superiority. What did you think about this devastating clash between authentic activism and performative politics? Was Stephen's attack on Bono's humanitarian work the end of his credibility as a moral voice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Smash that subscribe button for more shocking celebrity revelations, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories that expose the difference between real compassion and fake intellectualism.